You're standing on a hillway in Buckinghamshire in the dying light of a winter afternoon. The sky is bruised purple and gray. Bare trees claw at the horizon. And then you see it, rising from the ridge like a vision transported whole from the Loire Valley. A château of golden stone, turrets and chimneys silhouetted against the English dusk. Waddesdon Manor. It shouldn't be here. Nothing about it makes sense in this landscape. It's too grand, too French, too perfect. And that's exactly the point. This is not just a house. It's a statement. A fortress of taste. A machine built to buy something that no amount of money should be able to purchase. Acceptance. Behind those glittering windows, beneath the gilded ceilings, and amongst the Sèvres porcelain and Renaissance paintings, lies one of the most complicated stories in British architectural history. A story about a man who built a palace to prove he belonged. A story about a family that feared, despite all their wealth, they could lose everything in an instant. A story about servants who made the fantasy possible but remained invisible. A story about 2 world wars that shattered the illusion entirely and forced a reckoning with what this house, and all houses like it, really meant. This is the story of Waddesdon Manor. And it's darker than the guidebooks will tell you. You walk closer. Gravel crunches underfoot. The house looms larger. You imagine carriages pulling up this same drive in 1885, carrying dukes and earls, and, most importantly, the Prince of Wales himself, the future king. You imagine the man who built this place standing at the top of those steps, watching those carriages arrive, feeling, perhaps for the first time in his life, that he'd done it, that he'd made them come to him. His name was Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild, and he was Jewish. That fact, simple, immutable, inescapable, shaped every stone of this building. It dictated the guest lists, the art collections, the obsessive perfection of every detail. Because Ferdinand wasn't just building a house. He was building a shield, a stage, a place where he could control the narrative, where his taste and his wealth could speak louder than the whispers in London clubs and country houses, louder than the cartoons in the press that depicted his family as hook-nosed manipulators of nations, louder than the rising tide of antisemitism that was beginning to sweep across Europe like a fever. He thought, perhaps, that if the house was beautiful enough, grand enough, tasteful enough, he could make them forget, or at least make them need him enough that it didn't matter. And for a while, it worked. But here's what the history books often skip over: the cost. Not the financial cost. Ferdinand had more money than he could ever spend. No, the other costs. The human cost of maintaining the illusion. The psychological cost of living in a society that would never fully accept you, no matter how perfect your château. The moral cost of building your safety on the backs of dozens of servants who worked 16-hour days in the basements and attics, who were forbidden to be seen or heard, who made the magic happen while remaining ghosts in their own lives. And then there's the ultimate cost. What happens when the world you've built to protect yourself collapses anyway? When war comes? When borders close? When the same society you courted turns on you, seizes your property, murders your relatives, and reduces your palaces to empty shells? Waddesdon Manor survived both world wars. But it didn't survive them unchanged. By 1945, the fantasy was over. The parties had stopped. The illusion of safety through wealth had been shattered. And the family had to decide, what do you do with a house that was built to buy acceptance in a world that will never truly give it? If you're drawn to stories like this, stories that go beneath the surface of grand architecture to uncover the power, fear, and humanity underneath, then this is the channel for you. We don't do shallow house tours. We dig into the real history, the money, the politics, the hidden lives, the scandals, and the reckonings. If that's what you want, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment below telling me what other estates or families you want us to investigate. Because trust me, every grand house has secrets. And we're going to find them. Now, let's go back to the beginning. To understand Waddesdon, you have to understand the man who built it. And to understand Ferdinand, you have to understand the family he came from and the impossible position they occupied in 19th century Europe. The Rothschilds were, by the 1870s, the richest family in the world. They had built a banking empire that spanned 5 countries: England, France, Austria, Germany, Italy. Each branch run by one of the 5 sons of Mayor Amschel Rothschild, the Frankfurt banker who'd started it all. They financed governments. They funded railways. They were creditors to kings. They had, in effect, become indispensable to the functioning of European capitalism. And they were hated for it. Antisemitism in 19th century Europe wasn't a fringe belief. It was mainstream. It was respectable. It was woven into the laws, the social codes, the cartoons, the literature, the casual conversation of the educated classes. Jews could be tolerated, sometimes even admired, as long as they stayed in their lane, as merchants, as moneylenders, as useful outsiders. But the Rothschilds had broken that rule. They had become too powerful, too visible, too wealthy. And so they became targets. They were accused of controlling governments, of starting wars for profit, of secret conspiracies to dominate the world. None of it was true, but truth didn't matter. The myth of the Rothschilds was more powerful than the reality, and the family knew it. So they adapted. They learned to move carefully, to be generous in public, to build hospitals and fund universities and donate to the poor, to marry within the family to keep the wealth consolidated and the secrets contained, to build houses, magnificent, undeniable houses that would force society to acknowledge them, even if it would never fully accept them. Ferdinand was part of the English branch, but he was born in Paris and spent his youth in Vienna. His childhood was one of immense privilege and persistent unease. He was educated by private tutors, surrounded by art and music and languages, raised in palaces. But he was also reminded again and again that he was different, that there were places he couldn't go, clubs he couldn't join, families who would never marry their daughters to him no matter how much money he had. When Ferdinand was 18, his mother died. It was sudden, devastating, and it marked him for life. He inherited a vast fortune, but he also inherited a kind of loneliness that money couldn't cure. He was shy, sensitive, artistic, not the kind of man built for the cutthroat world of international banking. His cousin, Nathaniel Rothschild, ran the London Bank. Ferdinand was expected to play a supporting role, to manage estates, to host parties, to be the cultured face of the family, while others handled the ledgers. And that's what he did. But he wanted more. He wanted to belong, not just to be tolerated, not just to be useful. He wanted to be embraced. He wanted a place where he could gather the most powerful people in England around him and make them see him not as a Rothschild, not as a Jew, not as an outsider, but as one of them. So he decided to build a house. Not just any house. A house so beautiful, so perfectly curated, so filled with art and comfort and taste that no one could resist it. A house that would be a destination, a marvel, a place where even the Prince of Wales would want to spend the weekend. A house that would prove, once and for all, that Ferdinand de Rothschild belonged in English society. He chose a site in the Vale of Aylesbury, in Buckinghamshire, rolling countryside, good hunting, not too far from London, but far enough to feel like an escape. The land had once been a medieval hunting ground. Now it was farmland. Ferdinand bought it all, hundreds of acres. And then he hired a French architect named Gabriel Hippolyte de Staël to design a house that would be, in essence, a perfect recreation of a 16th century French château. Why French? Because French style was the ultimate marker of taste in Victorian England. Because the Loire châteaux represented the height of Renaissance elegance. Because building a house that looked like it belonged to a French duke was a way of saying, I am not nouveau riche. I am not a vulgar banker. I am a man of culture, of lineage, of refinement. It was also, perhaps, a way of distancing himself from Englishness. If he couldn't be fully English, he could be something else, something cosmopolitan, something European, something that transcended national borders. The Rothschilds were, after all, a transnational family. They spoke multiple languages, moved between capitals, operated in a world beyond flags and borders. Waddesdon would reflect that. But here's the thing. Building a French château in the English countryside in the 1870s was not a simple project. It was a logistical nightmare. The site Ferdinand had chosen was on top of a hill, beautiful for views, terrible for construction. There were no roads that could handle the kind of heavy machinery and materials required. So Ferdinand built them. He carved new roads into the hillside. He brought in a small army of laborers, locals, yes, but also specialists brought in from France and across Europe. Stonemasons, carpenters, plasterers, glaziers, landscapers. He imported the stone from France. He brought in marble from Italy. He shipped in tiles, bricks, metalwork, glass. He had trees, fully grown trees, some of them 40 feet tall, uprooted from other estates and transported by rail and cart and sheer human effort up the hill to be replanted in his gardens. It was an act of will, an act of transformation. He was literally reshaping the landscape to fit his vision. The house took 5 years to build. From 1874 to 1879, Waddesdon was a construction site. Hundreds of men worked on it. Ferdinand was there constantly, overseeing every detail. He wasn't a distant patron who signed checks and waited for the result. He was obsessed. He had opinions about every molding, every fireplace, every door handle. He wanted perfection, because imperfection would be noticed. And if it was noticed, it could be mocked. And if it was mocked, the whole project, the whole fantasy, would collapse. And it wasn't just the house. Ferdinand understood that a great house needed great surroundings. So he built gardens. Not English gardens, formal French gardens, designed by a French landscape architect named Elie Lane. Parterres, fountains, statuary, aviaries filled with exotic birds, hothouses growing orchids and palms. He even installed a dairy, a model farm where cows lived in clean stalls and milk was produced under hygienic conditions, which was then given to the village as a gesture of noblesse oblige. He was building more than a house. He was building a world, a self-contained, perfectly controlled world where he could be the master, the host, the arbiter of taste. A world where, for a weekend at least, he could forget that outside the gates, there were people who would always see him as other. By 1880, Waddesdon Manor was ready. Picture it. The house sits at the top of the hill, glowing in the afternoon sun. The stone is honey-colored, warm, alive. Turrets rise at the corners. Chimneys cluster in sculptural groups. The roof is a complex geometry of slate and copper. It looks like it's been there for centuries, like it grew out of the soil. But it's brand new. It smells of plaster and varnish and fresh paint. Inside, the rooms unfold like a museum. The entrance hall is lined with wood paneling from a French château, real paneling, centuries old, bought at auction and shipped to England. The drawing rooms are filled with furniture that once belonged to kings and queens. Sèvres porcelain lines the shelves. Paintings by Gainsborough, Reynolds, Rubens hang on the walls. Not reproductions, originals, bought at extravagant prices from estates and dealers across Europe. Persian rugs, Venetian mirrors, crystal chandeliers. Every object is perfect. Every object has a story. Every object is a piece of evidence in Ferdinand's case for acceptance. He opened the house with a series of carefully planned parties. Small at first, friends, family, a few select aristocrats. Then larger. Then in 1885, the coup. The Prince of Wales agreed to visit. This was everything Ferdinand had been working toward. The Prince of Wales was the most important social figure in England. Where he went, society followed. If the prince enjoyed himself at Waddesdon, if he came back, if he spoke well of it, then Ferdinand would have achieved something almost unprecedented. A Jewish banker welcomed into the inner circle of English aristocracy. The Prince of Wales arrived on a Friday afternoon in December. It was cold. The house was blazing with fires in every room. Ferdinand had spent weeks preparing. Every meal was planned to the last detail. Every bedroom was outfitted with the finest linens, the softest towels, the most thoughtful touches, writing paper, fresh flowers, hot water bottles, books chosen to match each guest's interests. The prince was famously difficult to please. He loved luxury, but he hated stuffiness. He loved good food, but he got bored easily. He loved shooting, gambling, beautiful women, and witty conversation. Ferdinand had to provide all of it, and he did. The weekend was a performance, not just by Ferdinand, but by the entire household. The prince and his entourage, aristocrats, ladies-in-waiting, private secretaries, were greeted at the door by Ferdinand himself, dressed impeccably, smiling, gracious, the perfect host. They were shown to their rooms. They were given time to rest. Then they were brought down to the drawing rooms for drinks before dinner. Dinner was an 8-course spectacle. French cuisine, prepared by a French chef brought in specially for the occasion. Each course was paired with wines from Ferdinand's cellar, Bordeaux, Burgundy, Champagne. The table was set with porcelain and silverware that had once graced royal tables. Candles glowed. Conversation flowed. Ferdinand was charming, knowledgeable, deferential, but not obsequious. He knew when to speak and when to listen. He made sure the prince was entertained, flattered, comfortable. After dinner, the men retired to the smoking room. The women went to the drawing room. Later, there was music, a small concert performed by musicians brought in from London. Then cards. Then, finally, bed. The next day, shooting. This was crucial. The English aristocracy lived for shooting. Pheasants, partridges, grouse. The slaughter of birds was the defining pastime of the landed classes. Ferdinand didn't particularly enjoy it, but he'd stocked his estate with thousands of birds, raised specifically for this purpose. Beaters were hired to drive the birds into the air. Loaders stood ready to reload the guns. The prince shot dozens of birds. He was an excellent shot. He was happy. Lunch was served outdoors in a specially constructed pavilion, heated by portable stoves. More courses, more wine, then more shooting, then tea back at the house, then baths and rest, then another elaborate dinner, then more entertainment, perhaps a tour of the art collection, perhaps billiards, perhaps just more conversation and whiskey by the fire. It was exhausting. For Ferdinand, every moment was calculated. He was performing ease, but it required constant vigilance. One wrong dish, one uncomfortable bed, one dull conversation, and the whole thing could fall apart. But it didn't. The prince enjoyed himself. He came back. Again and again over the years, he returned to Waddesdon. He brought friends. He brought mistresses. He treated the house like his own private retreat. And because he came, others came. Dukes, earls, cabinet ministers, foreign dignitaries. Waddesdon became a fixture on the social calendar, a place where power and pleasure mixed, where deals could be made, where influence could be traded. Ferdinand had done it. He'd built the house. He'd opened the door. And they had walked through it. But let's pause here. Let's pull back the curtain. Because what you saw as a guest at Waddesdon, the effortless elegance, the seamless luxury, was an illusion. And illusions require machinery. In this case, human machinery. Beneath and behind the glittering rooms, out of sight of the guests, Waddesdon Manor was a hive of labor. Servants. Dozens of them. At the height of the house's operation, there were more than 40 permanent staff members living on the estate, and many more temporary workers brought in for parties. They had titles: housekeeper, butler, footmen, maids, cooks, kitchen hands, laundresses, grooms, gardeners, gamekeepers. Each role was rigidly defined. Each person had a place in the hierarchy, a set of duties, a uniform, a set of rules. The rules were strict. Servants were not to be seen by guests unless they were performing a specific task. If a maid was cleaning a room and a guest entered, she was to face the wall and stand still until the guest left. Servants used separate staircases, narrow, steep, hidden behind panels and in back corridors. They ate in separate rooms at separate times. They were forbidden to speak unless spoken to. They were forbidden to make noise, no footsteps, no clattering of dishes, no laughter. The effect was ghostly. Fires were lit, but you never saw who lit them. Meals appeared, but you never saw who carried them. Beds were made, clothes were cleaned and pressed and laid out, baths were drawn, and it all happened invisibly, silently, as if by magic. But it wasn't magic. It was labor. Hard, relentless, undervalued labor. The servant's day began at 5 or 6 in the morning. The kitchen staff started even earlier. Fires had to be lit, ovens heated, bread baked. Housemaids scrubbed floors, dusted furniture, polished silverware, emptied chamber pots. Footmen polished boots, laid out clothes, carried coal, served meals. The work was physical, repetitive, and never-ending. And they were paid very little. A housemaid might earn £12 to £20 a year, barely enough to save anything. Room and board were provided, but the rooms were tiny, cold, often shared. The food was adequate but plain. There was no privacy, no leisure, no autonomy. Why did they do it? Because the alternative was worse. For a young woman from a rural village, a position in a grand house like Waddesdon was one of the few respectable jobs available. It was better than factory work, better than agricultural labor, better than destitution. It offered a kind of security, a kind of status. You could say you worked for the Rothschilds. And if you were lucky, if you were skilled and obedient and kept your head down, you might rise through the ranks. You might become a head housemaid or even a housekeeper, a position of real authority within the servant hierarchy. But you would always be a servant. You would always be invisible. Ferdinand, for his part, was considered a good employer. He paid on time. He didn't abuse his staff. He funded a school in the village and provided cottages for married servants. He was, by the standards of the time, humane. But the system itself was inhumane. It was a system that required one group of people to make themselves invisible so that another group could live in comfort. It was a system built on inequality, so profound that it was considered natural, inevitable, the way things simply were. And Ferdinand participated in it, not because he was cruel, but because he didn't question it, because it was the cost of a life he wanted to live. If the house was Ferdinand's shield, the art collection was his sword. He understood, perhaps better than any of his contemporaries, that in English society, taste was a form of power. Not just wealth. Wealth could be crass, vulgar, nouveau riche. But taste? Taste was refinement. Taste was education. Taste was proof that you deserved your position. And Ferdinand had impeccable taste. He spent decades assembling one of the finest private art collections in Europe. He didn't just buy what was expensive. He bought what was significant, what had history, what had provenance. He wanted objects that told stories, stories that connected him to the past, to the courts of kings, to the great artistic traditions of Europe. He bought paintings by Gainsborough and Reynolds, portraits of English aristocrats, the very people whose acceptance he sought. He bought Dutch old masters, Rubens, Van Dyck, paintings that had once hung in royal palaces. He bought Renaissance bronzes, medieval tapestries, illuminated manuscripts. He bought furniture that had belonged to Marie Antoinette. He bought Sèvres porcelain that had been commissioned by Louis XV. Every object was a piece of armor. Every object said, "I am not an outsider. I am a custodian of European civilization. I am worthy of your respect." And he didn't just buy and hoard. He displayed. The house was arranged like a museum. Each room had a theme. The green drawing room was filled with French furniture and porcelain. The red drawing room was hung with portraits and tapestries. The tower drawing room, Ferdinand's private sitting room, was a jewel box of Renaissance treasures. He gave tours. When guests visited, he would walk them through the rooms, explaining the history of each piece, telling the stories of where he'd found them, how he'd acquired them. He was a brilliant storyteller. He made the objects come alive. He made his guests feel like they were in the presence of history, of beauty, of something larger than themselves. And it worked. People were dazzled. They wrote about Waddesdon in their letters and diaries. They described it as one of the most beautiful houses they'd ever seen. They praised Ferdinand's taste, his generosity, his knowledge. But there was something else happening here, something deeper and more poignant. Ferdinand wasn't just collecting art. He was collecting legitimacy. He was collecting proof that he belonged. Every painting, every piece of furniture, every porcelain vase was a link in a chain that connected him to the history of Europe, a history that had often excluded and persecuted his people. He was saying, "I may be a Rothschild, I may be Jewish, but I am also a European. I am also an heir to this culture. I have as much right to these objects, to this beauty, to this history, as anyone. And yet, there was an irony here. Because many of the objects he collected had come from aristocratic families who had fallen on hard times. Families who had sold their heirlooms to pay debts, often debts owed to banks. Sometimes to Rothschild banks. So Ferdinand was, in a sense, buying the remnants of a dying world. He was buying the symbols of a class that was losing its power, even as he was trying to join that class. He was preserving their treasures, even as they could no longer afford to keep them. It was a strange, sad, circular relationship. The aristocrats needed his money. He needed their acceptance. The art was the medium of exchange. And perhaps Ferdinand understood this. Perhaps that's why, in his private moments, he seemed melancholy. Friends described him as kind, thoughtful, cultured, but also lonely. He never remarried after his wife Evelina died young and childless. He threw magnificent parties, but he often seemed distant at them, as if he were watching from the outside even when he was at the center. He had built the house. He had filled it with beauty. He had opened the doors. But he was still, in some essential way, alone. Because here's the truth, acceptance was always conditional. Ferdinand could host the Prince of Wales. He could be praised for his taste. He could be invited to some houses, some dinners, some shooting parties. But he would never be fully one of them. There were still clubs that wouldn't admit him. Still families that wouldn't marry into his. Still whispers behind his back. And beyond England, things were getting worse. In France, the Dreyfus affair, a scandal in which a Jewish army officer was falsely accused of treason, ignited a wave of violent antisemitism. In Germany and Austria, anti-Semitic political parties were gaining power. In Russia, pogroms were killing thousands of Jews. Across Europe, the poison was spreading. The Rothschilds were insulated by their wealth, but they were not immune. They felt the danger. They saw the cartoons, read the pamphlets, heard the speeches. They knew that no matter how much money they had, how many houses they built, how much art they collected, they could never be truly safe. Ferdinand felt this acutely. He was a man who valued beauty, order, harmony. He wanted to believe that civilization, art, culture, refinement, could overcome prejudice. He wanted to believe that if he could just show people who he really was, they would accept him. But the world was changing, and it was changing in a direction that terrified him. Still, he kept going. He kept hosting. He kept collecting. He kept playing the role of the perfect English country gentleman. Because what else could he do? Give up? Admit defeat? Let the house fall silent? No. He would keep the fantasy alive as long as he could. And for a while longer, it held. The parties continued. The guests came. The Prince of Wales shot pheasants and drank champagne and laughed by the fire. The servants cleaned and cooked and stayed invisible. The art glowed in the lamplight. The house stood on its hill, golden and perfect, a monument to one man's dream of belonging. But beneath the surface, the cracks were forming. Let's go deeper into the machinery. Because to truly understand Waddesdon, you have to understand the servant system that made it possible. And to understand that system, you have to understand the sheer scale of labor required to maintain the illusion of effortless elegance. 40 servants lived on the estate. 40 people whose entire lives revolved around the house and the family. They lived in the attics and basements. They slept in small, sparsely furnished rooms, often 2 or 3 to a room. They shared bathrooms. They ate together in the servants' hall, a large, utilitarian room with long tables and benches. The hierarchy was rigid. At the top, the butler and the housekeeper. They were the commanders, the ones who managed the other servants, who kept discipline, who made sure everything ran smoothly. Below them, the footmen, the ladies' maids, the head cook. Below them, the housemaids, the kitchen maids, the scullery maids. At the very bottom, the hall boys and the scullery boys, who did the dirtiest, hardest work, scrubbing pots, hauling coal, emptying slops. Your position determined everything. What you wore, where you slept, who you could speak to, what you ate. Higher servants got better food, more privacy, more respect. Lower servants got the leftovers and the smallest rooms. And you could not cross the lines. A footman did not fraternize with a housemaid. A lady's maid did not speak to a scullery boy. The hierarchy was not just about efficiency. It was about control. It kept the servants divided, kept them focused on climbing the ladder rather than questioning the system itself. The workday was brutal. A housemaid's day might look like this. 5:30 a.m., wake up. Dress in uniform. Go downstairs. 6 a.m., light the fires in the main rooms. Carry coal up from the basement. Sweep the hearths. Dust the furniture. 7:30 a.m., breakfast in the servants' hall. 15 minutes. 8 a.m., clean the bedrooms. Make the beds. Empty the chamber pots. Dust. Sweep. Polish the mirrors. 10 a.m., clean the public rooms. Drawing rooms, dining room, library. Dust every surface. Polish every piece of silver. Straighten every cushion. 12 p.m., lunch in the servants' hall. 20 minutes. 12:30 p.m., laundry duty or mending or helping in the kitchen, depending on the day. 4 p.m., afternoon tasks. Polishing brass. Scrubbing floors. Whatever the housekeeper assigns. 6 p.m., dinner in the servants' hall. 30 minutes. 6:30 p.m., turn down the beds. Lay out evening clothes. Draw baths if required. 8 p.m., wait. Be available in case you're needed. Stay in your uniform. Stay alert. 10 p.m. or later. Finally, bed. If the family is entertaining, you might not finish until midnight or later. And this was every day. 6 days a week. Sunday, you got a few hours off to attend church. That was it. There were no holidays, no vacations, no sick days unless you were truly incapacitated. If you complained, you could be dismissed. And dismissal, without a reference, meant you would never work in a good house again. So you stayed. You worked. You kept your head down. And here's the thing that's easy to forget. These were real people. Young women, mostly from villages and small towns. They had dreams, fears, desires. They fell in love. They gossiped. They laughed when no one was listening. They resented the rules, the exhaustion, the invisibility. But they were trapped, not by chains, but by economics, by the structure of the society they lived in, by the fact that there were so few options for women of their class. Ferdinand, as I said, was considered a good employer. He didn't beat his servants. He didn't sexually exploit them, as far as we know. He provided decent wages by the standards of the time. He built housing for them. But he also benefited from the system. He lived in luxury because they worked themselves to exhaustion. He hosted parties where guests marveled at the seamless service, never thinking about the labor that made it possible. Did he think about it? Did he ever walk past a housemaid scrubbing a floor and wonder what her life was like? Did he ever feel a pang of guilt? We don't know. He didn't write about it. The servants didn't leave diaries. They didn't have time. And most of them couldn't write well. History is written by the people who had the time and education to write. The servants are mostly silent. But we can infer. We can look at the system and understand what it required. We can see the long hours, the low pay, the lack of autonomy. We can see the way the house was designed, the hidden staircases, the separate entrances, the spatial segregation that kept servants and family apart. We can see that the beauty of Waddesdon rested on a foundation of invisible, undervalued labor. And we can recognize that this was not unique to Waddesdon. This was how the entire upper class lived. This was the norm. But that doesn't make it right. And it doesn't mean we should ignore it. Because if we only tell the story of the beautiful house and the cultured baron and the royal guests, we're telling a lie. We're erasing the people who actually made it all possible. So let's name them. Not individually. We don't have the records for that. But collectively. Let's acknowledge that Waddesdon Manor was built and maintained by the labor of dozens of working-class men and women who gave their time, their health, their youth to keep the fantasy alive. They were part of the story. They were part of the cost. And when we walk through Waddesdon today, when we admire the gilded furniture and the Renaissance paintings and the perfectly manicured gardens, we should remember, this was not magic. This was work. And the people who did that work deserve to be remembered too. Now, let's move forward in time. Because the world Ferdinand had built, the world of country house parties and royal visits and art, collecting, and invisible servants, was about to be shattered. The cracks had been forming for years. Anti-Semitism was rising. Political tensions were escalating. Empires were jockeying for power. And in 1914, it all exploded. August 1914. Europe went to war. It started with an assassination in Sarajevo. Within weeks, the great powers had mobilized their armies. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized to defend Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia and France. Britain declared war on Germany. The continent tore itself apart. And the Rothschild family found itself in an impossible position. Remember, this was a transnational family. They had branches in England, France, Austria, Germany, Italy. For a century, they had operated across borders, moving money and information freely, leveraging their international network to build their power. But now the borders were closed. The nations were enemies. And the Rothschilds were forced to choose sides. In England, the Rothschilds were British. In France, they were French. In Austria and Germany, they were subjects of the Central Powers. Cousins who had grown up together, who had spent summers at each other's estates, who had worked together in the family business, were now on opposite sides of a war. It was devastating, not just emotionally, but financially. The family bank had been built on the idea of international cooperation, of moving capital across borders to wherever it was needed. But now capital couldn't move. Assets were frozen. Communication was cut off. The Rothschilds in London couldn't speak to the Rothschilds in Vienna. The bank, the very foundation of their power, was fractured. And there was something even more painful: the suspicion. In every country, people whispered that the Rothschilds were loyal to the other side. In England, some accused them of being German agents. In Germany, they were accused of being tools of the British. In France, they were accused of being pro-German. Everywhere, the old anti-Semitic tropes resurfaced. The Rothschilds are loyal only to themselves, only to money, only to their own secret agenda. None of it was true. The Rothschilds in each country were loyal to their adopted nations. They bought war bonds. They donated to the war effort. Some of the younger men enlisted. But the suspicion lingered. At Waddesdon, the war changed everything. The parties stopped. The guests stopped coming. The Prince of Wales, now King Edward VII's successor, King George V, had more important things to do than weekend shooting parties. The house, which had been built for entertaining, fell silent. Ferdinand was in his 70s by now. He was in poor health. The war horrified him. He had spent his life trying to build bridges between nations, between classes, between his Jewish heritage and the European aristocracy. And now he watched as those bridges burned. He died in 1898, actually, before the war. I need to correct the timeline here. Let me adjust the narrative. Ferdinand died in 1898. He had lived to see Waddesdon reach its peak, but he also died knowing that the acceptance he'd sought was still fragile, still conditional. He left the house to his sister Alice, who continued to run it in much the same way he had, hosting, collecting, maintaining the fantasy. But Alice died in 1922 after the war. And by then, the world Ferdinand had built for was gone. World War I destroyed the old order. It destroyed empires. Austria-Hungary collapsed. The Ottoman Empire fell. The German Empire was defeated and humiliated. It destroyed the illusion of European civilization as a force for progress and enlightenment. It destroyed the certainty that wealth and culture could protect you from chaos. The Rothschild family survived, but they were weakened. Their international network was shattered. Their wealth was still vast, but their influence was diminished. And the anti-Semitism that had always been there, simmering beneath the surface, began to boil over. In Germany, in the chaos after the war, conspiracy theories about the Rothschilds flourished. They were blamed for the war. They were blamed for Germany's defeat. They were blamed for the economic collapse that followed. The Nazis, when they rose to power in the 1930s, made the Rothschilds a central part of their propaganda. The family became a symbol of the Jewish financier, who was supposedly destroying Germany from within. It was insane. It was a lie. But it was believed. And then came World War II. This time, the danger was existential. The Nazis didn't just hate the Rothschilds for their wealth. They hated them for being Jewish. And the Nazi plan was not to tax the Jews, or exclude them, or humiliate them. It was to exterminate them. When Germany annexed Austria in 1938, the Rothschild palaces in Vienna were seized. Louis Rothschild, the head of the Austrian branch, was arrested. He was held in prison for over a year and only released after the family paid a massive ransom, essentially signing over their Austrian assets to the Nazis. The family fled. Those who could get out got out. To England, to America, to Switzerland, anywhere that was safe. But not everyone made it. Some Rothschild relatives were caught. Some were sent to concentration camps. Some were murdered. Waddesdon, meanwhile, became a refuge. The house, which had been built as a place of pleasure, now served a different purpose. It housed members of the family who had fled from France and Austria. It became a temporary home for children evacuated from London to escape the Blitz. And it became a secret hiding place for some of Britain's greatest art treasures. The British government, fearing that Nazi bombs would destroy the national museums, moved thousands of artworks out of London. Paintings, sculptures, manuscripts, priceless pieces of Britain's cultural heritage, were packed up and hidden in country houses. Across England, Waddesdon was one of those houses. Its strong walls, its remote location, made it ideal. So into the rooms that had once glittered with parties, crates were stacked. Rembrandts, Titians, Vermeer, the treasures of the National Gallery, hidden away, waiting for the war to end. It was a strange, poignant reversal. Ferdinand had filled Waddesdon with art to prove that he belonged to European civilization. Now, European civilization was entrusting its art to Waddesdon for safekeeping. The house was no longer a palace. It was a fortress, a hiding place, a refuge. James de Rothschild, Ferdinand's great-nephew, had inherited Waddesdon. He joined the British Army and fought in the war. His wife, Dorothy, stayed at Waddesdon and managed the estate. She oversaw the evacuation children. She coordinated with the government officials who were storing the art. She kept the house running with a skeleton staff. Many of the younger servants had gone off to war or to work in factories. The fantasy was over. The illusion of effortless elegance, of timeless aristocratic leisure, was revealed for what it had always been, a performance. And the stage had been abandoned. Waddesdon survived the war physically. No bombs fell on it. The art was safe. But the world it had been built for was gone. After the war, James and Dorothy faced a decision. What do you do with a house like Waddesdon in 1945? The old way of life was unsustainable. Servants were harder to find. People had other options now, better options. Taxes were high. The British government, rebuilding after the war, needed money, and they taxed the wealthy heavily. Many great country houses were being abandoned, demolished, or sold. James and Dorothy loved Waddesdon, but they also recognized that it couldn't be a private home anymore. It was too big, too expensive, too much. So they made a decision that would define the house's future. They would give it away, not to family, not to a private buyer, but to the National Trust, a British charity that preserves historic buildings and opens them to the public. In 1957, James de Rothschild died. In his will, he left Waddesdon Manor, along with its art collection and a substantial endowment, to the National Trust. His widow Dorothy continued to live in part of the house and manage the transition. It was an extraordinary act of generosity, but it was also an acknowledgement of reality. The age of the private palace was over. If Waddesdon was going to survive, it had to become something else. It had to become public. And it did. In 1959, Waddesdon opened to the public as a museum. People came. Thousands of them. They walked through the rooms that had once been reserved for royalty and aristocrats. They saw the art, the furniture, the porcelain. They marveled at the beauty, the craftsmanship, the sheer extravagance of it all. But they also learned the story. The real story. Not just the fairy tale of the beautiful house and the cultured baron, but the complicated, painful human story of a family that built a palace to buy acceptance, that lived in fear despite their wealth, that survived persecution and war, and that ultimately chose to share what they had built rather than let it die. Dorothy de Rothschild lived until 1988. She spent the last decades of her life overseeing Waddesdon's transformation into a museum. She worked with curators, historians, gardeners, administrators. She made sure the house was preserved not as a frozen relic, but as a living space, somewhere people could come and learn and be inspired. She also made sure the servants were remembered. She commissioned oral histories, collected records, installed exhibits that told the story of the people who had worked at Waddesdon. She understood that the house was not just the family story. It was their story too. When she died, she left Waddesdon in the care of a family trust, with the National Trust continuing to manage the property. Today, it's run by the Rothschild Foundation, funded by an endowment from Jacob Rothschild, the current head of the English branch. The house is still there, still beautiful, still golden in the afternoon light. But it's no longer a private fantasy. It's a public legacy. And that transformation from private palace to public museum is, in many ways, the most important part of the story, because it forces us to ask, what is a house like Waddesdon for? Ferdinand built it for himself, for his family, for his dream of acceptance. It was a private space, a fortress against the world. But by becoming public, it became something else. It became a place where anyone can come and see beauty, art, history. It became a place where we can ask questions about wealth, power, class, and who gets to own the past. It's not a simple story. It's not a story of heroes and villains. It's a story of human complexity, of a man who wanted to belong and built a palace to prove it, of a family that lived with fear and prejudice despite their wealth, of servants who made the fantasy possible but remained invisible, of a house that survived war and loss and became, in the end, a gift. So what do we do with Waddesdon now? What do we make of it? You can visit today. The house is open most of the year. You can walk through the same rooms Ferdinand walked through. You can see the same art he collected. You can stand on the terrace and look out over the gardens and the valley beyond and try to imagine what it felt like to be him, to stand in this place he created and wonder if it was enough. The guides will tell you the history. They'll tell you about the art, about the architecture, about the family. They'll tell you about the Nazis seizing the Vienna palaces. They'll tell you about the art treasures hidden here during the war. But they'll also tell you about the servants, about the long hours and the hard work, about the people whose names we don't know, but whose labor made everything possible. And that's important, because it would be easy to turn Waddesdon into a place of nostalgia, a place where we romanticize the past and wish we could live like that. But the truth is more complicated and more interesting. Yes, Waddesdon is beautiful. Yes, it's full of incredible art and craftsmanship. Yes, it represents a level of taste and sophistication that's rare. But it also represents inequality. It represents a world where one man's dream of acceptance required the labor of dozens of people who had no choice. It represents a family that, despite their wealth, could never be fully safe from prejudice and violence. And it represents a turning point. Because the Rothschilds, by giving Waddesdon to the National Trust, were acknowledging that the old way of life, the private palace, the exclusive world, the fortress against society, was no longer tenable. They were saying, this belongs to everyone now. The beauty, the art, the history, it's not just ours. It's yours too. And that's radical. That's a rejection of the idea that beauty and culture are the private property of the wealthy. It's an assertion that heritage, history, and art are public goods. Of course, there are complications. Waddesdon is still controlled by a family trust. It's still funded by Rothschild money. The family still has influence over how the story is told. But they've chosen to tell a more honest story than many families would. They've chosen to include the difficult parts, the antisemitism, the servant labor, the fears and failures. And they've made the house accessible. Admission fees are modest. School groups come on subsidized visits. There are programs for people with disabilities, for people who can't afford the entry fee, for communities that have historically been excluded from these spaces. Waddesdon is trying, in other words, to be more than a monument to one family's wealth. It's trying to be a place where we can all grapple with the past, the beauty and the ugliness, the art and the exploitation, the dreams and the fears. Does it succeed? That's for you to decide. But I think there's value in the attempt. Because if we only preserve the beautiful houses and ignore the uncomfortable questions, we're lying to ourselves. We're pretending that the past was simpler and nobler than it was. And if we tear down every grand house because it represents inequality, we lose something too. We lose the art, the craftsmanship, the tangible connection to history. So maybe the answer is what Waddesdon represents: preservation with honesty, acknowledgement of beauty and cost, a refusal to romanticize, but also a refusal to erase. Let's talk about what Waddesdon means in the context of the Rothschild family's larger story. The Rothschilds are still here, still wealthy, still influential, though nothing like they were in the 19th century. The family bank is no longer a global colossus. It's been broken up, sold off, restructured. Other financial institutions have eclipsed it. But the family endures, and they've diversified. Some are bankers. Some are scientists. Some are philanthropists. Some are environmentalists. Some have stepped away from the public eye entirely, and they still face antisemitism. The conspiracy theories have never gone away. The myths about Rothschild control of the global financial system persist on the internet, in fringe political movements, in the fevered dreams of people looking for simple explanations for complex problems. None of it is true, but it's believed, and it's dangerous. So when you visit Waddesdon, when you walk through those rooms and see that art and hear that history, remember, this is not just a story about a house. It's a story about identity, about fear, about the limits of wealth as protection. Ferdinand built Waddesdon to prove he belonged, but he never fully belonged. He was tolerated, admired, even loved by some. But he was always, in some eyes, other. And that's a tragedy. Not because he deserved to be accepted by the English aristocracy. Aristocracies are inherently unjust, and acceptance into an unjust system is not a victory. But because he deserved to be safe. He deserved to live without fear. He deserved to be judged for who he was, not for his religion or his family name. And the fact that he wasn't, the fact that none of the Rothschilds, no matter how wealthy or cultured or generous, could ever be fully safe, tells us something important about the world he lived in, and about the world we live in now. Because anti-Semitism is not dead. It's not a relic of the 19th century or the Nazi era. It's alive. It mutates. It adapts. It hides in conspiracy theories and dog whistles and coded language. And we have to resist it. We have to call it out. We have to refuse to let it become normalized again. That's part of Waddesdon's legacy too. It's a reminder of what happens when prejudice is allowed to flourish. It's a reminder that wealth can't protect you from hatred. That beauty and culture and generosity are not enough to keep you safe if the society you live in refuses to see you as fully human. So yes, Waddesdon is beautiful, but it's also a warning. We need to talk about the gardens. Because the house is only half the story. The landscape around it, the gardens, the parkland, the carefully designed views, are just as important to understanding what Ferdinand was trying to create. When Ferdinand bought the land in the 1870s, it was farmland. Fields, hedgerows, dirt roads. Nothing grand. Nothing picturesque. It was, by the standards of English estate design, boring. So he changed it. Completely. He hired Elie Lane, a French landscape architect, to design formal gardens in the style of the great French châteaux. Parterres, geometric flower beds arranged in intricate patterns. Gravel paths. Fountains, statuary, topiary, but he also created an English landscape park. Rolling lawns, clumps of trees, serpentine paths, artificial lakes, the kind of naturalistic, pastoral scenery that the English aristocracy loved. A landscape that looked natural, but was actually entirely designed. And here's the most extraordinary part. He moved trees. Not saplings. Not young trees. Fully grown, mature trees. Some of them 40 feet tall, weighing tons. He had them dug up from other states, sometimes hundreds of miles away, transported by rail and then by cart, and replanted at Waddesdon. It was a monumental undertaking. Trees are not meant to be moved like furniture. Many of them died. But Ferdinand kept trying. He was obsessed with creating an instant landscape, a place that looked like it had been there for centuries. Why? Because an old landscape conferred legitimacy. It suggested continuity, tradition, rootedness. If Waddesdon looked like it had been there forever, maybe people would forget that it was brand new. Maybe they would forget that Ferdinand was an outsider. So he manufactured history. He manufactured nature. He made the landscape lie for him. And it worked. Visitors marveled at the beauty of the grounds. They walked through the gardens and down to the lake and through the woods, and they felt like they were in a timeless, perfect English estate. But it was all artifice, all performance. Even the animals were part of the show. Ferdinand stocked the estate with deer, peacocks, exotic birds. He built aviaries where guests could admire rare species. He created a model dairy where cows lived in spotless stalls and milk was produced under hygienic conditions, a kind of fantasy farm that bore no resemblance to actual agricultural life. It was Disneyland before Disneyland. A curated, controlled environment designed to produce a specific emotional response. Awe, delight, a sense that you were in a special, enchanted place. And the servants maintained it all. Gardeners worked year-round to keep the flower beds perfect, the lawns trimmed, the paths swept. Gamekeepers managed the deer and the pheasants. Groundskeepers repaired fences, cleared drains, painted gates. The natural beauty of Waddesdon required constant, intensive labor. Nothing was left to chance. Nothing was actually natural. And that's a metaphor for the whole place, isn't it? The house, the art, the gardens, they all look effortless, timeless, inevitable. But they're not. They're the product of enormous effort, enormous expense, enormous control. They're an illusion. A beautiful, seductive illusion. But an illusion nonetheless. Today, the gardens are still maintained by the Rothschild Foundation. They're immaculate. The parterres are replanted seasonally with tens of thousands of flowers. The lawns are perfect. The trees, or rather, the descendants of the trees Ferdinand moved, are mature and majestic. And visitors love them. People come to Waddesdon as much for the gardens as for the house. They walk the paths, take photos, have picnics on the lawn. But I wonder how many of them think about the labor. About the gardeners who arrive early every morning to deadhead the roses, to weed the beds, to trim the hedges. About the infrastructure hidden beneath the beauty. The irrigation systems, the drainage, the compost heaps, the tool sheds. Probably not many, because that's the point of the illusion. You're not supposed to see the machinery. You're supposed to see only the result. And maybe that's fine. Maybe it's okay to just enjoy the beauty without thinking about the cost. But I think there's value in pulling back the curtain, in recognizing that beauty is not free, that it requires work, resources, decisions about priorities and values. Because if we pretend that beauty just exists, that grand houses and perfect gardens are natural and inevitable, then we let ourselves off the hook. We don't have to ask, who paid for this? Who maintains it? Who benefits from it? Who is excluded from it? Those are uncomfortable questions. But they're important questions. And Waddesdon, to its credit, is starting to ask them. The foundation has installed exhibits about the gardeners, about the techniques used to maintain the grounds, about the environmental challenges of managing a historic landscape in an era of climate change. They are trying to be transparent, to show the work, not just the result. And they're also trying to make the gardens more sustainable, using less water, reducing pesticide use, planting native species, thinking about how to preserve this place not just for today, but for the future. It's a shift from a 19th century model of total control and artifice to a 21st century model of stewardship and honesty. It's not perfect, but it's something. And it raises a bigger question. What do we owe to the past? Do we preserve places like Waddesdon exactly as they were, even if that means maintaining systems and practices that we now recognize as unjust or unsustainable? Or do we adapt them, change them, make them reflect our current values? There's no easy answer. But I think the conversation itself is valuable, because it forces us to think about what heritage means, what preservation means, what we want to pass on to the next generation. Waddesdon is not a museum frozen in time. It's a living place, still evolving, still grappling with its own history. And that, ultimately, is what makes it interesting. Not just the beauty, not just the art, but the questions, the tensions, the way it forces us to confront the contradictions of the past and the challenges of the present. So, here we are, at the end of the story, or maybe not the end, because Waddesdon is still here, still open, still evolving. But the end of Ferdinand's story, the end of the fantasy he built. Let's step back and ask, what was Waddesdon really about? On the surface, it was about a house. A beautiful, extravagant, perfectly designed house filled with art and surrounded by gardens. A place where royalty came to shoot pheasants and drink champagne. A place that represented the pinnacle of taste and wealth in the Victorian era. But underneath, it was about something much deeper. It was about fear. Ferdinand de Rothschild was afraid. Not of poverty. He would never be poor. Not of obscurity. His family name was too famous for that. He was afraid of rejection, of exclusion, of being seen as other, as outsider, as not quite human. He was afraid because he was Jewish in a Christian society, because he was a banker in a world that despised bankers, because he was a Rothschild in a world that told conspiracy theories about Rothschilds. And he hoped, that if he could just build the perfect house, collect the perfect art, host the perfect parties, be the perfect gentleman, then maybe he could make them forget. Maybe he could make them see him as one of them. And to an extent, it worked. He did win acceptance of a sort. The Prince of Wales came. The aristocrats came. They ate his food and admired his taste and shot his pheasants. But they never forgot. They never fully accepted him. He was always, in some corner of their minds, the Jewish banker, the Rothschild, the outsider who had bought his way in. And then the world changed. The wars came. The fantasy collapsed. And the Rothschilds learned what Ferdinand had perhaps always known, deep down, that money and beauty and culture could not protect you from hatred. That no house, no matter how grand, could be a fortress against the poison of antisemitism. So what is Waddesdon's legacy? It's complicated. On one hand, it's a testament to human creativity and ambition. It's a place of genuine beauty. The art is extraordinary. The craftsmanship is unparalleled. The gardens are stunning. Millions of people have visited and been inspired, educated, moved. That's not nothing. That matters. On the other hand, it's a monument to inequality. It was built on the labor of servants who had no choice. It represents a system where one man's dream of acceptance required the invisibility and exhaustion of dozens of others. It's a reminder that beauty often has a cost. That luxury often rests on exploitation. That the grand houses we admire were not built by the people whose names are on the plaques. They were built by the people whose names we don't know. And it's a warning about what happens when a society allows prejudice to flourish. When it tells a group of people, no matter how wealthy, how cultured, how generous, that they will never truly belong. Because that's what killed the fantasy of Waddesdon. Not the taxes, not the changing economy, not even the wars. It was the realization that no amount of wealth or taste or effort could buy safety. That the house Ferdinand built to protect himself could not, in the end, protect him or his family or his people. So when you visit Waddesdon today, what should you feel? Admiration, yes, for the beauty, the artistry, the ambition, but also discomfort for the inequality, the exploitation, the fear that made it necessary, and maybe also hope, because the Rothschilds chose, in the end, not to let the house die. They chose to share it, to open it to the public, to tell the complicated story, the beauty and the ugliness, the dreams and the fears. They chose transparency over myth, honesty over nostalgia. And that's a lesson for all of us. Because we all live with the legacies of the past. We all inherit systems, structures, stories that are both beautiful and ugly. And we have to decide, do we pretend the past was simpler than it was? Do we romanticize it, sanitize it, turn it into a fairy tale? Or do we tell the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it complicates the story? I think we owe it to the past and to the future to tell the truth. Waddesdon Manor is a beautiful house. It's also a house built on fear, maintained by exploitation, and transformed by tragedy. It's a place where art and inequality coexist, where beauty and cost are inseparable. And that's okay. That's reality. History is messy. People are complicated. Places are layered with meaning, with contradictions, with stories that don't resolve neatly. Our job is not to simplify. Our job is to look closely, to ask questions, to resist easy answers. So the next time you see a grand house, whether it's Waddesdon or Blenheim or Versailles, or any of the thousands of palaces and estates that the landscape of Europe, don't just admire the beauty. Ask the questions. Who built this? Who paid for it? Who cleaned it? Who was excluded from it? Who was harmed by it? Who benefited? And ask, what does this place mean today? What should we do with it? How should we remember it? Because these houses are not just relics. They're active participants in our culture. They shape how we think about the past, about wealth, about power, about who gets to tell the story. And we get to decide what they mean. Waddesdon chose honesty, chose complexity, chose to be a place not of nostalgia, but of reckoning. And that, I think, is the most important legacy of all. Not the beauty, though the beauty is real. Not the art, though the art is extraordinary. But the willingness to look at the past without flinching, to see it whole, to honor the dreams and acknowledge the costs. That's what Waddesdon offers, if we're willing to see it. So, go visit if you can. Walk through the rooms. Stand in the gardens. Look at the paintings. But don't just look. Think. Question. Remember. Remember Ferdinand, standing at the top of the steps, watching the carriages arrive, hoping he'd finally done enough. Remember the housemaid scrubbing floors at dawn, invisible and exhausted. Remember the family members who fled the Nazis, who lost their homes, who survived but were forever changed. Remember the art treasures hidden in the house during the war, waiting in the dark for a better world. Remember that beauty and ugliness are not opposites. They're intertwined. They're part of the same story. And remember that the story is not over. Waddesdon is still here, still asking questions, still forcing us to reckon with the past. And that, in the end, is what makes it worth remembering.